YouTube originals.
So I grew up in a place called McLean, Virginia, right outside of DC. But I split my childhood basically. So we'll start with where I first grew up. So I'm really excited to show you guys this. So this is my hometown. We were the only black family on the block. I was the only black kid in my grade, one of 3 black families in my school. And if we look, folks are in the 99th percentile who grew up here when it comes to average income. Less than 1% are incarcerated. We can look at teenage birth rate, less than 1%. Around high school, my folks got divorced and we moved into the city. It's the exact opposite. It wasn't until I got to DC that I actually had a benchmark for understanding everyone didn't grow up the way I did. And it took, my parents getting divorced and us moving to the city for me to actually understand how fortunate I really was.
Zip code influences so much that we have got to make sure that those neighborhood conditions aren't setting people up for failure.
We are keeping people of reasonable means out of neighborhoods.
While I was doing some research, I came across this, which is the Opportunity Atlas. And it's a map that shows you the average life outcomes for people who grew up in a given census tract. It's just crazy to think that I may have only become as successful as I am because I spent the majority of my childhood here instead of in DC. But why don't we take a look at where you guys grew up?
Da-da-dum. Writing appears. Does my neighborhood determine my future? White titles are sketched in. Glad you asked. Season 2. Young white male Chris Toff shows his colleagues where he's from in California.
So you're like in the Bay Area.
Oh yeah. I mostly grew up in Cupertino, California.
Oh, okay.
Majority Asian, definitely fairly wealthy, a lot of tech, Silicon Valley employees.
All right. So I'm gonna put in my zip code where I grew up. So I just took you guys to Brooklyn, New York, Crown Heights, and immediately traveling here, it's just completely red. Yeah, so 30K, that makes a lot of sense to me.
But it also this shows how segregated Brooklyn is and was at the time.
Yeah. So right here at Grand Army Plaza, it just looks so different from the blocks where I grew up in Brooklyn. And so that was our Saturday activity. Let's go to the library, let's go to the park. And that was kind of escaping a lot of the segregation in Crown Heights to go to this area where the amenities were better.
Did you notice those neighborhoods being cleaner?
Absolutely. And I think the biggest thing was trees. Just how many trees do you have on your block? I think it does something to your psyche where it's oh, I feel like I can breathe better. I feel like someone cared enough to beautify this area.
Well, guys, thank you for taking the time out to come look at this with me and showing me where you grew up. I want to talk to this professor at NYU to see if I can get some information and some insight into how we actually got here.
So I think the overarching important message to take away is that segregation was intentionally designed. There were a number
Designed by who?
By a wide range of policymakers on the local level all the way up to the federal level.
When did we start to see the government actually leading a lot of these programs when it came to segregation?
So the federal government instituted these massive housing programs during the New Deal to save a housing market that was in severe distress. The first policy was called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, or HOLC. Part of HOLC was sending appraisers, real estate appraisers, to hundreds of cities across the country, and these appraisers would grade neighborhoods in these cities, and this is where the term redlining comes from.
In your lease, it would say you cannot resell this house to a black family.
Yeah.
So let me explain. As these appraisers surveyed cities across the United States, they created maps that they distributed to banks. And the banks used these maps to decide how risky it would be to provide loans or mortgage assistance to different neighborhoods around the country. And each of these maps was assigned a color. So green indicated this was the most desirable area, and the map we're looking at right now is an area in the northern suburbs of Chicago. And along with these maps, we were given documents that described the neighborhood that was being surveyed. If we take a look at the top, we can see the class and occupation. We can also see the number of black families in this area, and the preferred nomenclature of the 1930s was Negro. There were 0. Moving on to the next classification were blue neighborhoods. And blue neighborhoods were considered to still be desirable. So as we take a look at the description of this blue area in Chicago, the percentage of foreign families is still 0. The percentage of Negro families, still none. And as we come down to the description, we see the area is well laid out and improvements are attractive, but the proximity of Negro families on Spruce Street at the southern edge precludes the district from a better rating and is retarding its development. The proximity of Negro families, that's so crazy. So as you can see, these maps didn't ignore race. In fact, they were heavily dependent on it. Race played a key factor in determining the value of these neighborhoods and their ratings to the banks. The yellow neighborhoods were listed as definitely declining. This one had 50% foreign families, those foreign families being Polish and German. Race wasn't the only determining factor in whether or not these neighborhoods had value. Immigrant families heavily impacted whether or not it got a favorable evaluation. And as we move on to the last designation of these neighborhoods, we come to red neighborhoods. And this is actually where we get the term redlining from. And these neighborhoods were defined as hazardous. And when we look at the description of the area, the number of foreign families, 5%. They were Italians, with the percentage of Negro families, 90%. And as we make our way down the description sheet, we see this concentration of Negroes in Evanston is quite a serious problem for the town, as they seem to be growing steadily and encroaching into adjoining neighborhoods. These maps are how the federal government institutionalized segregation, and they use race to determine the value of all of these neighborhoods. So I want to understand how all of these red lines are impacting people's lives today.
HOLC was passed in 1933, and before that time, places where HOLC made those redlining maps and places that didn't have those maps were about the same level of segregation. And the measurement that we use is a fairly common measurement of segregation called black isolation. Then by 1950, 1960, we see that cities that were where the redlining maps were created, there's this huge jump here.
This one sort of moment, they were collecting the data and published the data, and it vastly impacted millions of American lives from that point on.
Yeah. This gap emerges especially as the Federal Housing Administration and the GI Bill kick in after HOLC, and then we're layering on schools, highways, et cetera, suburbanization, and then all that gets locked in place. So I would say that the gap that we see today is a result of structural racism, which includes the wealth gap. It includes this history of exclusion. It includes the intentional segregating of neighborhoods.
What impact did this have on our economy and the ability for people to participate in it?
Housing segregation has all these other layers on top of it, including education and employment opportunities. So the isolation of people of color, in this case specifically African Americans, has dramatically limited the ability of African Americans to kind of achieve what we generally consider to be kind of middle-class status, home ownership, wealth stability, the ability to pass on resources to the next generation.
Any other interesting takeaways from this?
It didn't have to be this way.
Red brick buildings line a narrow street in Manhattan, New York.
So we just learned about how the government has historically segregated neighborhoods across America, but I wanted to understand how these problems are affecting people today. I'm getting ready to meet up with two former testers from the Fair Housing Justice Center. So tell me exactly what a tester is. What did you all do in that capacity?
It's a way of finding out what landlords or real estate agents are saying to people when they think no one else is listening. If you're a real person going out looking for a home to rent or to buy, you provide your information and you're given certain information about what's available in what neighborhoods at what price levels. You have no way of knowing if someone of a different race or ethnicity or any of the protected characteristics is being told the same thing as you.
What are the ways that we're seeing housing discrimination play out right now?
Anytime I hear somebody say, oh, white supremacy, white privilege is just a myth in this country, I say, come do my job for half an hour and you'll see the way the doors get opened for me. I actually had this very nice woman in Brooklyn showing me an apartment. We're always instructed to convey disinterest. She said, tell you what I'm gonna do. Let me write down the number for the entry code for the lobby door. If I'm not here, you just let yourselves in, go up to the 4th floor, show her around the apartment because I'd really love to see you guys in here.
Most of my experiences are not like Craig's at all. I don't want to paint the picture that every time I'm sent out to test, I'm discriminated against. But I have been involved in cases where very clear discrimination happened. At times, I am shown the apartment, but I'm quoted a higher rent, $300, over my white counterpart. At times, not shown amenities in the building, not encouraged to apply, where my white counterpart was encouraged to apply.
Lisa, what do some of those experiences that you've had, what do they tell you about what regular folks might be going through?
When you're a tester, as an African American, I'm representing all the African Americans that went and inquired at that building and were lied to. So I represent so many other people of color who are experiencing this while just looking for housing, and housing is a basic need.
Lee strolls down a New York street.
So when my dad sold our house in DC, we had to get it appraised twice. And the first time it was appraised, the value was set at about $800,000. But my dad knew that our neighbors on the same block were selling their houses for much more than that. So we spoke to a realtor who told him to take all of the family photos off of the walls, leave them bare, and get it appraised a second time. In that second appraisal, the value was set at about $1.2 million. And at the time, I didn't think that was motivated by race. But now, after talking to these testers, I'm starting to think that race maybe played a role in the home's valuation.
Lee greets a man.
Toby?
Yeah.
Hey man, I'm Lee.
Good to meet you.
Tell me a little bit about what you guys do at Open New York.
So we are a pro-housing group. We advocate for more housing and more affordable housing all across New York. We are on 11th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue in Brooklyn, Park Slope. And we're looking at a building that couldn't be built today as of right in Brooklyn.
Why is that?
So the zoning rules prohibit it. So in 2003, this area was downzoned.
Why would people want to downzone this neighborhood?
If you owned here, restricting supply is in your interest because it makes your own property more valuable. And that's been the story here for the last 40 going on 50 years.
New York City famously rezoned nearly 200,000 properties between 2003 and 2007 under the Bloomberg administration. But a lot of this rezoning was actually downzoning. Here in Park Slope, some areas were downzoned to preserve the historic brownstones, while other areas were rezoned to increase housing density. How does this impact segregation? At a racial level, at an economic level?
It's brutal, right? By privileging incumbents, and by incumbents I mean largely homeowners, you're entrenching all of your existing segregation. And let's be honest, America is way too segregated today.
And so by downzoning, if this were a white neighborhood, you're making it much harder for it to become a more diverse area.
Absolutely. You are actively working against it.
Lee takes a video call from Fabiola.
Fabiola, what's up? How are you?
Hey Lee, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I just got in touch with this mother in Philadelphia whose children are struggling with lead poisoning, and I want to go talk to her because I feel like this story might really embody the very real consequences of housing segregation, but I'm still looking for someone to talk to about home ownership and the racial wealth gap, and I thought you might have some ideas.
Someone that I've actually talked to before on this is Andre Perry. He's a fellow at the Brookings Institute, actually, so he's based here in DC.
That's perfect. Do you have time to talk to him while I'm in Philly?
Yeah, I'll see if I can get in touch with him.
Amazing.
Why is home ownership important in terms of economic mobility?
Well, when you own a home, you're more likely to be economically and socially mobile. But home ownership also precludes you from moving every time there's an economic shock. Home ownership predicts for better health, particularly during a pandemic. I can't think of another asset that is so influential on a person's life chances than housing.
What have you found about the differences in property value between predominantly black neighborhoods and predominantly white neighborhoods? What does that chart tell us?
Homes in neighborhoods where the share of the black population is less than 1%, on average are priced about $340,000. And as the percent of black people in a neighborhood increases, you see the home prices decrease. And so much so that when the share of the black population is 50% or higher, the home prices on average is about half as much as their white neighborhoods.
So you're saying it's as simple as the more black people in a neighborhood, the less the houses are worth?
That's exactly right. A lot of people will look at that prior chart and say, oh, that's because of education, that's because of crime. We control for education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics. And what we found is homes in black neighborhoods are underpriced about 23%, about $48,000 per home. Accumulatively, that's about $156 billion in lost equity.
And how does racial segregation factor into housing valuation?
Well, you know, segregation has a long-standing impact on a number of things. Cities are becoming more concentrated with poor folk, and that is reducing those areas' abilities to pay for services like education, policing, infrastructure. So when you concentrate poverty in areas, not only are you putting a target on those communities back in terms of harmful policies, but you have less resources in a neighborhood. We've got to address this, because if folks can't achieve the American dream through housing, then they're not going to achieve the American dream in any other part of their life.
So I'm on my way to Philadelphia, a city where nearly 8% of the children under the age of 7 are struggling with lead poisoning. Lead is a heavy metal, and when it gets into your blood, it can cause anything from a reduced IQ to ADHD, and some research has actually linked it to school failures and even criminality. And while lead paint has been illegal since 1978, a number of the homes here in Philadelphia were built well before then. So I'm getting ready to meet up with a family whose lives have been reshaped by their zip code.
The sign reads, "Toxic housing."
Hey.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, I'm Lee. Nice to meet you.
I'm Angel.
So where are we right now?
Oh man, we're in the area of Alany in Philadelphia.
Okay. And you used to live out here?
Yes, I did.
So your kids got sick living in this house?
Yes, they did.
What happened?
I took them to the doctor one day just for a random checkup, and come to find out my daughter had a 9 lead level, and my son, at the time he was 2, he had a 18 lead level.
Jesus. What happened after you found out that your children had lead poisoning?
I contacted,
Did you call the landlord? Or?
Yes, I contacted the landlord. The city were actually called by the doctors. They had to do the gun test. My children's room, which was the middle room, they had the highest lead levels in the whole house.
How are you dealing with this? You know, you're working mom, you have 3 children.
It's hard, it's extremely hard. Who wants to have their children get lead poisoning? But when you are a single parent, you have 3 children, you're doing everything by yourself, how can you make enough money to just up and leave?
What kind of a message does that send you about, you know, where you live?
You know, if you were to live in Center City, it just wouldn't happen. The suburbs, it would not happen.
So you made the decision to get your kids out of here?
Yes, I did. I actually moved to a hotel.
For how long?
For about a month and a half.
So
yes.
Where are you living now?
In Reading.
In Reading? Where's that?
Yes. About an hour and 10 minutes away from here.
Can you show me where?
Yes.
Now they're in her new house in Reading.
Okay, so this is your new house in Reading.
Yes.
So tell me about this place.
Well, when I first got here, it looked immaculate.
Right.
3 days after, my wall started to have a little crumbling where I saw water.
Can you show me? Can you take a look?
Yes. Up here, there's mold all throughout the ceiling. This is where the water leaks at on the floor. And here, this is more water damage. This right here was seeping water the other day.
Jeez.
There's mold down here, just coming out the wall. So I went from one bad situation to a worse situation. I'm literally on unemployment because I was laid off at my job. I have nowhere to go.
When people say things like, you know, America is the land of opportunity, you just gotta work hard, you just gotta pull yourself by your
That's a lie. Because I moved from the last place to come here. So what's next?
In his smart apartment, with bare brick walls and a framed basketball shirt on the wall, Lee leans over a balcony.
Okay, so I know that I grew up privileged. I know that I was incredibly fortunate to have attended great schools, to know from a young age that I could afford to pay for college, and to just have fresh air to breathe and clean water to drink. What I didn't know growing up was that this was an incredibly rare experience, especially if you're someone that looks like me. I had no idea that the full weight of history was actively working against me having that experience. My parents beat the odds, largely because we always owned homes in this family going back generations, and that had a direct impact on my chances in life. But the scarcity of stories like mine isn't a problem that any one of us can fix. It is, however, something that we don't have to passively accept. In trying to find out whether or not your zip code determines your future, I did see some bright spots. For decades, zoning laws were used to restrict access, but now in some cities, they're being used to encourage investment and create more diverse neighborhoods. There are private firms that are investing in low-income luxury housing that's meant to convert renters into homeowners, and some landlords and members of the real estate industry have woken up to the role that they've played in perpetuating housing segregation and restricting the upward mobility of our neighbors for generations.
For every dollar the typical white household has, the typical black household has about 9 or 10 cents. And this is connected directly to this legacy of redlining and exclusion from the opportunity to build home equity. So undoing that is going to require as big, if not a bigger, investment than was made in the New Deal.
Let's excite the economy in the same way we're doing during COVID, the same way we did after the Great Depression, but we just didn't do it for black people. So now's the time to really correct those wrongs.
Ultimately, we can't reverse the course of history without those who dug this hole reaching in and pulling us back out.
In a rehearsal, Lee wanders around a room where projectors are projecting images of the yellow and red areas he was discussing earlier. A camera operator takes up a position.
Do y'all want to change this background?
I'm Lee and I'm going to find out.
You want I'm Lee and I'm going to find out, or you want does your neighborhood determine your future? I'm Lee Adams, and this is Glad You Asked by Vox.
Vox Media Studios. YouTube Originals.